The wire fence stood where no battlefield map expected urgency. Late 1944. Cold air. Mud pressed flat by boots that no longer marched. Patton's forward elements arrived not to seize a crossroads or silence a gun, but to stop, suddenly, decisively, before a prison complex that had survived the war by being ignored. The gate was still locked. The men behind it were still alive. When the barrier came down, the war changed shape. Allied prisoners of war stepped forward hesitantly, thin figures blinking into daylight as if time itself had shifted without warning. Some moved with care, uncertain whether the ground beyond the fence belonged to freedom or another deception. Others simply stood still, absorbing the sound of engines that were not German, voices that spoke their language again. They looked less like soldiers than men returning from a different climate of history. Patton's officers did not wait for instructions. Instinct took over where procedure had not yet arrived. Rations were opened. Water was passed hand to hand. Guards were posted not against escape, but against confusion. Trucks were redirected. The logic was simple and unspoken. Permission could follow, but lives came first. Whatever the regulations said, these men were done waiting. A single moment carried the meaning of the day. An airman, barely upright, tried to salute, muscle memory overriding weakness. His arm trembled halfway up and stalled. A medic stepped in without ceremony, answered the salute with a cigarette and a blanket, and guided him to the ground. No speeches, no photographs, just recognition that survival, not symbolism, mattered most. But liberation did not arrive alone. Within minutes, victory produced a new emergency. Thousands of underfed, diseased, injured men became a medical and logistical crisis all at once. They needed care, transport, quarantine, protection. Roads that were meant for armor filled with ambulances. Medics trained for combat wounds now faced starvation and shock. The war had opened a gate and created a burden that could not be postponed. Reports moved faster than supplies. The message climbed the chain of command stripped of nuance. Patton had freed the prisoners. He had done it without formal coordination. The act was righteous. The consequences were immediate. Headquarters now had to absorb an event that had not been scheduled, planned, or distributed across the coalition. The gates were open. The men were free. And somewhere far from the fence, commanders were beginning to ask whether doing the right thing first might still carry a cost that had not yet been counted. For George S. Patton, speed was not merely a preference, it was a moral principle. War, as he understood it, punished hesitation more reliably than error. The front was always moving, always changing, and decisions made too late were indistinguishable from decisions never made at all. Waiting for signatures while men suffered behind wire was, in his mind, a failure of command. Patton did not see liberated prisoners as assets to be processed on a timetable. They were Allied soldiers, Americans, Britons, Canadians, men who had already paid for delay with hunger and years of captivity. Leaving them even 1 hour longer, simply because a form had not been filed, felt intolerable. In Patton's calculus, liberation delayed was liberation denied. He also understood something less tactical, but equally powerful: the moral clarity of the act itself. Freeing prisoners was a victory that required no explanation. No map could make it clearer. No communique could make it sound better. Men walking out of camps spoke directly to the public, to families, to history. Some victories were measured in ground taken. Others were measured in faces restored. There was a moment, brief, unrecorded, that hardened his resolve. Patton spoke to a returned prisoner, a man whose uniform no longer fit his body. The conversation was short. The details were unnecessary. What mattered was the look Patton carried away from it. From that point, the issue ceased to be procedural. It became personal. The war was no longer abstract at the gate. Patton's brilliance often came from how he treated rules. To him, they were tools, designed to enable action, not restrain it. If a rule delayed what was obviously right, he believed it had already failed its purpose. Initiative, in his view, was the highest loyalty a commander could offer the mission. His staff saw the other side immediately. Liberated prisoners triggered protocols that existed for reasons hard-learned: intelligence debriefs, disease control, transport priority, security screening. None of these could be improvised without cost. The machinery of coalition war was about to feel the strain. Patton had already acted. The gates were open. The question now moving up the chain was no longer what had been done, but whether history would remember it as heroic initiative or dangerous indiscipline waiting to be named. In a headquarters far from the opened gates, the report arrived without drama and without warmth. Patton had opened prisoner camps. Men were moving. Trucks had been diverted. No prior coordination had passed through coalition channels. Bernard Montgomery read the message slowly, not because it was unclear, but because its implications were already expanding in his mind. His thoughts went first to order, chains of command, designated boundaries, planned tempo. War, as Montgomery practiced it, was not an arena for improvisation, but a system designed to prevent waste and surprise. Every unit moved according to purpose. Every resource had a schedule. A sudden humanitarian victory, unplanned and uncontained, threatened to bend that system at its weakest points. Montgomery respected results. He had never doubted Patton's energy or courage. What he distrusted was improvisation that demanded others absorb its cost. Liberating prisoners was righteous. Diverting trucks, medics, and roads without warning was something else entirely. Planned operations did not pause simply because a good deed had been done ahead of schedule. A staff officer, watching from the edge of the room, noticed the expression that signaled trouble. Montgomery's face remained calm, almost serene. There was no anger in it. That was how his disapproval arrived: quiet, analytical, and already moving toward consequence. When Montgomery raised questions, they were rarely emotional. They were structural. The rivalry's deeper shape revealed itself in that moment. Patton saw friction as weakness, an obstacle to be crushed by speed. Montgomery saw friction as the price of control, proof that systems were holding under strain. Where Patton trusted instinct, Montgomery trusted process. Both believed they were protecting victory. He understood immediately that this would not remain a humanitarian story. It would become a coalition story, about authority, precedent, and the boundaries of initiative in a shared command. If one commander could act first and explain later, the balance holding the alliance together would begin to shift. The cold open settled into its central question. Patton had followed his moral impulse through the gate. Now the war waited to hear what Montgomery would say when that impulse broke the procedural frame, and who, in the end, would decide how righteousness was allowed to move. For George Patton, war was decided in moments that did not wait to be scheduled. His operational faith was built on motion: seize the opening, exploit the gap, strike before the enemy could recover his balance. Stability, to Patton, was not a goal, but a danger. The longer an army paused, the more time it gave its opponent to adapt. Bureaucracy, in this view, was simply another form of delay, wearing a respectable uniform. Within that logic, freeing prisoners of war was not a deviation from doctrine. It was an extension of it. Enemy control over Allied lives was a form of occupation no less real than a fortified town. Breaking that control shattered morale, denied the enemy leverage, and restored fighting spirit to the coalition. To Patton, the gate was just another weak point in the German system, and speed was the correct weapon. He believed the coalition ultimately rewarded results. History, he assumed, did not linger over methods when outcomes were undeniable. Ground taken erased arguments. Victories silenced critics. In that mental framework, initiative was not a risk. It was insurance. If success arrived quickly enough, questions would lose their urgency. A small but telling moment followed the liberation. Patton's staff drafted a message upward through command channels. Its tone was polite, almost deferential. The wording expressed regret for any inconvenience, but beneath the courtesy ran a clear assertion: we did what had to be done. The action spoke first. Explanation would follow if required. It was diplomacy written at speed. The deeper truth began to surface. Patton's actions were not purely humanitarian. They were also a declaration of command style. This was how he fought, by acting faster than systems could restrain him, by forcing reality to reorganize around his decisions. Liberation became proof not only of moral clarity, but of tempo. He had moved first. Others now had to respond. Patton assumed criticism would dissolve under the weight of the images themselves. Emaciated men stepping into freedom were a moral shield no memorandum could penetrate. He trusted that compassion, once displayed, would outrun regulation. In his experience, outrage faded when confronted with undeniable human good. Yet this confidence carried a quiet edge of hubris. Patton began to believe that righteousness created its own authority. If the cause was just and the result visible, coordination could be treated as optional rather than essential. Speed, he felt, had earned that privilege. As the front continued to move, Patton pressed forward, convinced that initiative would carry him through any resistance, procedural or personal. But elsewhere, commanders were beginning to weigh not the virtue of the act, but the precedent it set. And they were preparing to test whether initiative alone could be allowed to define how a coalition fought a war together. Bernard Montgomery's philosophy of war was built around preservation, not caution for its own sake, but the careful protection of strength over time. He believed victory came from minimizing waste, reducing uncertainty, and keeping the plan intact long enough for it to work. Where others sought momentum, Montgomery sought coherence. War, to him, was not a series of brilliant moments, but a sustained act of control. From that perspective, the liberation of prisoners of war was both sacred and dangerous. Sacred because it restored Allied lives to freedom. Dangerous because uncontrolled movement could unravel fragile systems. Starved men carried disease. Unscreened returnees carried intelligence risks. Thousands of bodies moving without routing strained supply lines already stretched to the limit. Roads meant for fuel and ammunition could become choked with ambulances and trucks, carrying men who could not yet fight or even walk unaided. Montgomery believed deeply that good intentions did not excuse operational damage. War was unforgiving of sentiment when sentiment distorted priorities. Schedules existed not to satisfy bureaucracy, but to ensure that tomorrow's battles could still be supplied. If humanitarian action bent those schedules without coordination, it risked sabotaging the very victory meant to make liberation permanent. In one quiet moment, he pointed at a map spread across the table. He did not gesture at enemy positions or planned advances. He traced roads, railheads, supply depots. This, he said calmly, was what decided what could be sustained. Armies did not move on courage alone. They moved on tonnage. Without control of infrastructure, even the noblest actions collapsed into chaos. The deeper fear was not Patton's compassion. Montgomery did not doubt it. What troubled him was the precedent being set. If one commander could act first and explain later, however justified the act, then unity began to fray. Coalition war depended on trust that all commanders were bound by the same restraints. Break that assumption, and coordination became negotiation, then competition. His disapproval was not emotional. There was no anger in it, no personal resentment. It was structural. Montgomery believed Patton had struck at the coalition's nervous system, the invisible network that allowed disparate armies to function as one. Damage there would not show immediately, but it would surface at the worst possible time. As he prepared his response, Montgomery understood how it would sound to others: cold, pedantic, possibly inhuman. But responsibility, in his view, often wore an unattractive face. The words he was about to choose would not soothe. They would define limits. And as those words took shape, the coalition moved closer to a moment where discipline and impulse would collide, forcing its leaders to decide which kind of victory they were trying to protect. The men who walked out of the camps did not step into resolution. They stepped into crisis. Starvation had altered their bodies. Exposure had thinned their resistance to cold and disease. Infections moved quietly through weakened systems. Injuries long untreated had become permanent. Psychological shock lingered behind hollow eyes. These were not men who could simply be handed a meal and sent home. Liberation had revealed how much damage captivity had done. The immediate response bent the front. Trucks meant for ammunition and fuel were diverted to carry the newly freed. Medics trained to treat battlefield wounds found themselves confronting malnutrition, typhus, frostbite, and collapse. Units were reassigned not to advance, but to guard camps, escort columns, and secure routes against enemy remnants and the chaos that followed sudden movement. Victory had opened a second front behind the first. In a field hospital hastily expanded beyond its design, a physician moved from cot to cot with a clipboard. He did not ask where the men had been captured. He marked who could be moved, who could wait, and who could not. Triage, once a measure of survival under fire, became a measure of how quickly freedom itself could be sustained. Every mark carried consequence. The deeper reality emerged with clarity. Liberation was not a single act. It was a supply mission requiring food, fuel, and shelter. It was a medical operation demanding quarantine, treatment, and time. It was an intelligence event, as returned prisoners carried knowledge of camps, guards, and German morale that needed careful extraction. All of it had to happen simultaneously, and none of it could be improvised without cost. Patton's initiative had delivered moral clarity. No one could argue against the rightness of opening the gates, but the strain it placed on the coalition was immediate and measurable. Resources were finite. Every truck redirected to prisoners was one less reaching the front. Every medic assigned to recovery was one not patching soldiers still fighting. The coalition now had to absorb the consequences in real time without slowing the war itself. From this angle, Montgomery's caution began to shift in meaning. What had sounded like cold restraint now resembled a warning about limits, about sustainability, about the dangers of allowing virtue to outrun structure. He had not argued against liberation. He had warned about what followed it. The belief that had driven the opening of the gates now reached its paradox. The more righteous the act, the heavier the responsibility it created. And as the coalition struggled to balance compassion with capacity, it became clear that the war was entering a phase where good intentions alone would no longer be enough. Once the gates were open, another system had to close around the men who walked through them. Reintegration was not a moment of relief, but a process, methodical, cautious, and slow by necessity. Each returned prisoner entered a pipeline designed to protect the armies they were rejoining. Screening came first, guarding against infiltrators and confusion. Quarantine followed, an unglamorous but essential barrier against outbreaks that could sweep through exhausted units. Nutrition was restored carefully, not generously, because bodies starved for months could fail when fed too quickly. Allied planners watched the numbers climb with unease. Disease did not respect front lines. Neither did rumor or misremembered intelligence. Armies already stretched thin could not afford outbreaks or misinformation spreading through camps and columns. What had been a moral victory now demanded bureaucratic vigilance. The price of compassion was patience. In one tent set aside for questioning, a bomber gunner sat across from an intelligence officer. He tried to speak. Words formed, then stopped. His story, of cold nights, roll calls, men disappearing, was too heavy for the checklist in front of him. The officer closed the folder and waited. This too was part of the process. Information extracted too quickly often arrived distorted or incomplete. The reveal followed quietly. Prisoners of war were not only survivors, they were carriers of strategic value. They knew camp locations, guard routines, shortages, morale fractures. They had heard rumors that never reached headquarters. But extracting that knowledge required time, rest, and trust. Intelligence rushed was intelligence wasted. Here, Patton's speed met its limit. Liberation had been immediate. Processing could not be. Every day added men to the backlog, waiting for screening, waiting for transport, waiting for clearance to move on. Momentum at the gate had become congestion behind it. Initiative had outpaced infrastructure. Montgomery pressed for order. Routes were designated. Transport was prioritized. Procedures were standardized so that every commander understood the cost and sequence of reintegration. It was not glamorous work. It did not produce headlines. But without it, the system would collapse under its own generosity. The strain continued to rise. Every truck carrying prisoners was a truck not hauling fuel or ammunition forward. Every medic assigned to recovery was one fewer at the front. The coalition now felt the weight of its own mercy, and as the pipeline stretched and tightened, commanders faced an unspoken question. How much compassion could the war afford before it began to starve itself of the means to finish? The contrast between George Patton and Bernard Montgomery was more than personal. It represented two theories of how wars were won. Patton believed in exploitation, strike fast, push hard, turn opportunity into momentum before the enemy could react. Montgomery believed in consolidation, secure gains, protect strength, ensure the plan held together under pressure. One trusted instinct, the other trusted system. Both wore the same uniform of alliance, but they marched to different clocks. Patton viewed Montgomery's caution as ego concealed within procedure. To him, restraint looked like hesitation, justified by paperwork. He believed victory belonged to those willing to move first and argue later. Montgomery, in turn, saw Patton's freedom of action as ego disguised as heroism, a preference for dramatic gestures that forced others to clean up the consequences. Each man believed the other was endangering the war in a different way. Between them moved the liaison officers, quiet figures carrying messages across invisible fault lines. They learned to soften language, to trim sharp edges from reports, to translate urgency into acceptability. In this role, they became emotional sandbags, absorbing shock so that orders did not explode on arrival. Their success was measured not in praise, but in the absence of open conflict. The deeper reveal followed. Coalition war was not only a struggle against the enemy, it was also a struggle against misunderstanding. American command culture prized initiative and speed. British command culture prized control and endurance. Each side used the same words, responsibility, discipline, leadership, but meant different things by them. The POW liberation event exposed those differences with uncomfortable clarity. What had begun as a humanitarian action now served as a proxy fight. It was no longer about prisoners. It was about who set norms inside the coalition. Could a commander act unilaterally if the cause was just? Or did justice itself require permission to remain coherent across a shared front? The argument touched nerves deeper than the incident itself. Montgomery understood that silence would resolve nothing. Precedent was forming whether he spoke or not. He began preparing a statement meant to define the boundary without inflaming the rivalry. Humanitarian action, he would insist, was not optional, but neither was operational coherence. Compassion had to move inside the system, not over it. The stakes were larger than reputation. If the alliance fractured along lines of personality and doctrine, the enemy would benefit without firing a shot. Montgomery weighed every word, knowing how they would be received by Patton, and how they would be interpreted by others watching closely. As the message took shape, the coalition held its breath. What Montgomery said next would either cool a rivalry sharpened by success or deepen it into something that no victory could easily undo. Patton framed his decision in terms that were both blunt and unanswerable. The enemy, he argued, had not consulted a schedule when these men were captured. No committee had approved their suffering. No timetable had governed the years they spent behind wire. To Patton, the idea that liberation required advance clearance felt morally inverted. When injustice was immediate, response had to be immediate as well. He believed freeing prisoners did more than correct a wrong. It struck at German authority itself. Camps were instruments of control, symbols of permanence meant to convince captives that the war had moved on without them. Opening those gates shattered that illusion. It told Allied armies that progress was real and told the enemy that his grip was failing. Morale, Patton believed, was a weapon, and liberation deployed it cleanly. There was a moment that sealed his certainty. A freed prisoner, still wrapped in a borrowed coat, reached out and shook Patton's hand. The grip was weak but deliberate. Nothing was said. It did not need to be. In that exchange, Patton felt vindicated in a way no staff memorandum could ever provide. The war, briefly, had a human face again. This was the core of Patton's leadership. He trusted what he could see. Visible suffering carried more authority for him than abstract projections. Men in front of him mattered more than plans behind him. Moral immediacy was not an obstacle to command, it was its engine. If leadership did not respond to suffering when it was visible, Patton believed it forfeited its legitimacy. Montgomery answered from a different frame. War, he insisted, was not ruled by immediacy. It was ruled by endurance. What could not be sustained would collapse, regardless of how just it appeared at the moment of action. A front overloaded with good intentions could still break, and when it did, the suffering multiplied rather than diminished. Neither man lacked logic, neither lacked evidence. Their arguments moved along parallel tracks that refused to intersect. One spoke the language of urgency. The other spoke the language of consequence. Each could justify himself convincingly, and each believed the other misunderstood the nature of responsibility. At this point, the shadow of Supreme Command returned. Eisenhower did not need to announce his presence. It was implied by necessity. Someone had to arbitrate, not because either man was wrong, but because both were right in ways that threatened cohesion. Coalition war did not permit two final answers to the same question. The struggle phase reached its defining tension. The coalition faced a truth it could not avoid. The right act, done the wrong way, could still damage the larger mission. Compassion without coordination risked collapse. Coordination without compassion risked moral failure. Between those poles, the alliance waited for a decision that would determine not just how prisoners were freed, but how authority itself would be exercised until the war was won. Montgomery's words arrived without force, and that was what made them cut. He did not speak of defiance or disobedience, he spoke of duty. A commander's responsibility, he said, was not only to act, but to coordinate, because coordination was the thin line that kept good actions from dissolving into chaos. In a coalition, intent alone was never enough. He acknowledged the moral virtue of freeing prisoners of war without hesitation. No one in the room doubted the righteousness of the act itself. Men had been suffering, gates had been opened, lives had been restored to daylight. But Montgomery insisted on a distinction that mattered deeply to him. Virtue had to be organized. Compassion that arrived without structure risked collapsing under its own weight. The officers listening recognized the style immediately. Montgomery did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He defined reality and allowed others to struggle against it if they wished. His tone was measured, almost instructional, as if he were explaining the mechanics of a bridge rather than the politics of command. This was how he imposed limits, by making them sound inevitable. The turning point landed quietly but decisively. Montgomery was not condemning compassion. He was condemning unilateralism inside a coalition war. No single commander, however effective or well-intentioned, could be allowed to redirect resources on his own authority. Trucks, medics, roads, and railheads were not private instruments. They belonged to the front as a whole. His warning followed with precision. If Patton could divert resources at will, however noble the cause, then others would soon feel entitled to do the same. The coalition would cease to function as a system and become a collection of competing impulses. One crisis would justify another. Order would erode not through malice, but through precedent. Montgomery framed the issue as one of survival. A fractured command could not sustain pressure. A war fought on instinct alone could not be finished cleanly. Coordination was not an administrative preference. It was the mechanism that allowed disparate armies to fight as one. Without it, victory would become accidental rather than assured. Patton heard the words differently. To him, they sounded like restraint imposed after success, like rules invoked only once someone else had moved first. He felt the edge of insult beneath the calm delivery. Montgomery, for his part, intended no personal rebuke. He believed he was defending the integrity of the front, not diminishing the courage of a fellow commander. The room absorbed the tension without resolving it. Both interpretations could exist at once. The act had been right. The method, Montgomery argued, could not become routine. In that space between agreement and accusation, the coalition paused to reconsider how authority would function in the months ahead. The decisive hinge settled into place. The question was no longer whether freeing the prisoners had been right. That much was already written in human terms. The question now pressing forward, quietly, inexorably, was who controlled how the right thing was done, and whether a coalition at war could afford more than one answer. Eisenhower stepped in, not with judgment, but with balance. Publicly, the liberation was honored without reservation. Gates had been opened. Allied men had been freed. The act was framed as a symbol of progress and resolve, something the public could understand without explanation. In that space, Eisenhower allowed the moment its dignity. Victories, especially moral ones, were not to be diminished in full view of the armies that depended on belief. Privately, the tone changed, not to scold, but to define. Eisenhower reframed the incident into doctrine rather than dispute. Humanitarian outcomes, he made clear, were mandatory. No commander needed permission to act to save lives in immediate danger, but coordination was non-negotiable. Rescue and order were not opposing values, they were sequential ones. One without the other could not endure. Inside headquarters, language mattered. Eisenhower's staff drafted messages with unusual care. Words were weighed for their ability to instruct without humiliating. Humiliation, Eisenhower understood, did not create discipline. It created resistance. Command authority that embarrassed its most aggressive leaders risked losing them when initiative was still needed. The reveal lay in Eisenhower's method. Supreme command, in practice, was often the art of saving everyone's face while saving the structure they all depended on. Patton needed to feel trusted. Montgomery needed to feel vindicated. The coalition needed to feel intact. Eisenhower's task was not to choose sides, but to prevent either side from tearing the alliance apart. Patton received clear guidance. Future prisoner of war actions were to be routed through established channels, medical, intelligence, transport, as rapidly as possible. Rescue was not to be slowed. Gates were still to be opened. But the aftermath had to be planned, shared, and absorbed across the front. Initiative would be preserved, but fenced. Montgomery, in turn, was reminded of a different danger. Discipline without visible humanity could fracture morale. Soldiers did not fight for systems alone. They fought for meaning. Responsibility, Eisenhower implied, had to look human if it was to be accepted. Control exercised without empathy risked appearing indifferent, even when it was necessary. The immediate crisis eased. Trucks were reassigned with greater clarity. Medical units coordinated intake. Intelligence teams adjusted timelines. On paper, the coalition functioned again as designed. The machinery held, yet something had changed. The rivalry had not been erased. It had been marked. Patton felt constrained where he once felt trusted. Montgomery felt justified, but exposed. Eisenhower had preserved the alliance, but at the cost of adding another scar to its internal map. The resolution was uneasy, but sufficient. The war continued. The gates would open again elsewhere. And behind every future act of compassion now stood a set of procedures. Quiet reminders that in a coalition war, even the most righteous victories required fences to keep them from unraveling the front they were meant to save. The story returned, inevitably, to the men who had stepped through the gates. Many survived because action had been fast. Hours mattered. Days mattered. For some, delay would have been fatal, but survival was only the beginning. Bodies weakened by months or years of captivity did not recover on command. Victory, for them, was not instant. It stretched forward into hospital wards, rehabilitation camps, and long silences where strength had to be relearned. Behind the lines, the cost accumulated quietly. Roads clogged with traffic never intended to flow there. Supply depots strained under demands they had not forecast. Fighting units surrendered trucks, medics, and guards to the prisoner mission, resources drawn away from the forward edge where the war still needed to be won. None of this appeared in headlines. It was the hidden arithmetic of compassion under fire. In one column moving toward a rear area camp, a military policeman walked alongside the prisoners he was escorting. He felt pride in the work. He also felt exhaustion settle into his legs. This was not the war he had trained for. There was no enemy in sight, no advance to mark. Yet he understood dimly that he was still fighting, only now against collapse, confusion, and neglect. The uniform was the same. The battle was not. The deeper understanding followed. Liberation was not a clean moral triumph. It was a complex humanitarian operation embedded inside active combat. Every success created dependencies. Every life saved required systems to sustain it. Compassion, once enacted, demanded infrastructure. Without it, suffering simply shifted location. Seen in this light, Patton's decision settled into its full shape. It was admirable. It was necessary. It was also disruptive. Reality allowed both to be true. Speed had saved lives. Speed had also forced the coalition to absorb costs it had not chosen on its own terms. Initiative delivered moral clarity, then demanded payment in coordination and sacrifice elsewhere. Montgomery's critique, too, took on weight. It was responsible. It was accurate. It was also emotionally costly. He did not speak the language of rescue well. His warnings arrived stripped of warmth, framed in tonnage and timetables rather than faces and names. To many, this made him appear distant at the very moment compassion felt most urgent. The truth he carried was necessary, but it was not comforting. Between these positions, the coalition learned something it could not afford to forget. War did not reward purity, it punished imbalance. Acts that felt unquestionably right still required management, or they multiplied suffering beyond their point of origin. The front was a system. Stress applied anywhere was felt everywhere. The climax did not arrive with a decision or a declaration. It arrived with understanding. Doing good under fire carried a cost that could not be wished away. It had to be paid, shared, and controlled. Otherwise, the very act meant to reduce suffering would scatter it across the war in quieter, less visible forms. And as the armies pressed forward again, the question left hanging was no longer about courage or compassion, but about whether the coalition could continue to do the right thing without losing the capacity to finish the war that made those acts possible at all. The men who returned from captivity did not come back empty-handed. Alongside trauma and exhaustion, they carried information, fragmented, imperfect, but valuable. They knew the layout of camps scattered across the Reich. They had seen shortages grow visible in German kitchens and guard rooms. They sensed morale fractures before they appeared on maps. Some had overheard rumors of retreat routes and improvised defenses. In aggregate, their memories formed a picture no aerial photograph could fully capture. Intelligence teams worked carefully, aware that truth arrived slowly from bodies pushed beyond endurance. Debriefings were structured, but patient. Small details mattered. The frequency of roll calls, the quality allowed in rations, the tone of guards' conversations. Each fragment sharpened the coalition's understanding of an enemy already bending under pressure. These were not revelations that won headlines. They were quiet truths that improved survival in the final months. In one session, a returned officer spoke in clipped sentences. He did not elaborate unless asked. Words, like food, appeared rationed. He described conditions without emotion, as if detachment were the only way to keep the story intact. The room listened closely, understanding that behind each short phrase lay months of endurance that could not be translated cleanly into reports. The larger reveal followed. Liberation itself became a strategic event. News traveled faster than columns. For occupied Europe, freed prisoners were proof that the Allies were arriving, not as rumors, but as presence. For Germany, they were evidence that control was collapsing from the inside. Camps once meant to remove men from the war now returned them as symbols of its nearing end. Yet the burden did not lift. Hospitals filled beyond capacity. Transport priorities shifted again and again. Units were reassigned not to fight, but to escort and care. The administrative weight of mercy continued to press against the front, demanding constant adjustment. Responsibility did not recede with success. It expanded. In this context, Patton's initiative took on a deeper meaning. It had accelerated freedom. It had also accelerated obligation. Opening the gates had not shortened the work. It had lengthened it, pulling future effort into the present. What had begun as an act of speed now required endurance from an entire system. The war moved closer to its conclusion with each mile taken. But another measure of victory emerged alongside the map. It was not counted in towns captured or lines advanced. It was counted in men restored, slowly, imperfectly, and at great cost, to something resembling life. And as the coalition absorbed that truth, victory began to look less like an endpoint and more like a responsibility carried forward by those who survived it. With distance, the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery began to look less like a clash of personalities and more like a tension between two virtues. Patton embodied urgency, the belief that suffering demanded immediate response, that delay was itself a form of harm. Montgomery embodied discipline, the conviction that without structure, even righteous action could hollow out the system meant to sustain it. Neither impulse was trivial. Neither was complete on its own. Far from headquarters, a Dutch civilian watched Allied convoys roll past his village. Trucks, ambulances, fuel carriers, guarded columns of men moving slowly toward the rear. He understood nothing of command debates or memoranda. He did not know who Patton was or why Montgomery objected. What he knew was simpler. Whether those convoys arrived tomorrow or not would decide whether his family ate, whether the war passed through his street or stalled in it. Survival, for civilians, depended on arguments they would never hear. The deeper reveal lay in time itself. Both men were right, but they were right on different clocks. Patton operated in minutes and hours, where lives could be saved or lost by immediate action. Montgomery operated in weeks and months, where systems either held together or collapsed under accumulated strain. One fought the war as it appeared in front of him. The other fought the war as it would exist if discipline failed. The coalition's moral psychology emerged from that tension. Strong personalities produced decisive action. They also risked bending shared purpose toward individual conviction. In a coalition, authority was always provisional, dependent on trust that others would not act solely on instinct or solely on caution. Too much of either could fracture unity. Eisenhower's leadership mattered most in this space. He did not attempt to eliminate the tension. He harnessed it. Patton's speed was preserved, but channeled. Montgomery's control was respected, but softened. Eisenhower acted as a bridge, not by choosing one virtue over the other, but by insisting they serve the same campaign. The alliance did not need uniformity. It needed compatibility. The prisoner of war incident became a lesson taught without classrooms. Compassion required logistics. Without transport, medicine, and coordination, mercy collapsed into chaos. Logistics required compassion to remain moral. Without human purpose, systems became indifferent machines. The two were not opposites. They were dependent. What Patton and Montgomery represented was not conflict to be resolved, but balance to be managed. One without the other produced failure of a different kind. Speed without structure burned itself out. Structure without urgency lost its soul. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the coalition carried this lesson forward quietly. It did not appear in manuals or speeches. It appeared in how decisions were made, faster than before, but not alone, more controlled than before, but not blind. The calm thesis settled into place. A coalition does not win by letting impulse defeat discipline or discipline defeat impulse. It wins when the two stop trying to conquer each other and begin to carry the same weight. The story returned to where it had begun, a wire fence, a gate forced open, men stepping into daylight that felt unreal after years measured by roll calls and ration lines. For a brief moment, the war ceased to be about movement and firepower and became something simpler: rescue. Engines idled, rifles lowered. History paused long enough for human beings to cross a line they had feared might never open. With time, Montgomery's words settled into memory differently. They were no longer heard as coldness, but as a warning about systems. Rescue, he had insisted, could not survive the collapse of command. If coordination failed, compassion would not multiply, it would scatter. Good intentions would collide, and chaos would replace care. His concern had never been the gate itself, but what followed it. Years later, one freed prisoner reflected on the moment of liberation. He said it felt immediate, almost unreal, as if suffering had been switched off without transition. Recovery, he added quietly, took years. Bodies healed slowly, minds even slower. Victory, he learned, had a long tail. The gate had opened in seconds. Its consequences unfolded across a lifetime. The final reveal emerged without drama. Patton's greatest strength, initiative, was also his most dangerous trait if left uncontained. Speed saved lives, but unbounded speed threatened unity. Initiative without structure could turn into a weapon wielded not against the enemy, but against the cohesion that made victory possible. Patton's instinct had to be fenced, not to blunt it, but to keep it pointed outward. Montgomery's greatest strength, control, carried a different risk. Discipline preserved armies, but discipline stripped of visible humanity eroded morale. Systems that forgot why they existed became indifferent to the people moving through them. Control, if not softened, became its own form of damage. Montgomery's restraint required warmth to remain legitimate. Between them stood Eisenhower, not as a hero of moments, but as a guardian of continuity. His authority was quiet by design. He did not resolve tensions by eliminating them. He contained them. The alliance, he understood, did not need harmony. It needed coherence. To keep opening gates, the structure behind those gates had to hold. The lesson inside the open gate was not simple, and it was not comforting. War demanded compassion, but it punished compassion without management. It required initiative, but it collapsed under uncoordinated virtue. The right act, left unguided, could still undo the mission it was meant to serve. In the end, the image endured. Gates opened. Men returned to light. But layered beneath that image was a quieter truth learned the hard way. Freedom, in war, did not move by instinct alone. It moved by plan, by structure, by cooperation among those who disagreed but remained bound together. Patton opened the gates without asking, until Montgomery reminded him that even freedom, in war, must be carried on a plan.